Hello, and welcome to Editor's Pick, a War Elephant podcast, episode 24. I'm your host, Ian,
And I'm Kristine.
And I'm Jaden.
and today we have a very interesting topic that we brought up last episode. Thought that it was interesting, and there haven't been that many serious news stories that we thought would take up an episode. So we decided to really devote this episode to an exploration of this issue. So, Jaden, why don't you start us off?
So this isn't a topic that I'm particularly knowledgeable about, but I hear about it a lot on Twitter. I've been somewhat following the topic, but of course I wasn't involved with it when it really was a big thing a few years ago. So the topic we're going to be talking about today is Gamergate, and Kristine and Ian admittedly know a lot more about it than I do. So why don't you two explain exactly what Gamergate is?
Well, exactly what Gamergate is I don't think anyone can actually answer that question with any kind of real accuracy because it was a pair of intertwined and viciously interacting social forces that boiled up into several other social movements. But we'll give it our best shot.
And it depends who you ask.
Well, we're asking us. So why don't we give our experiences with Gamergate? Kristine, how did you become aware of it and how did you follow it and learn about it yourself?
Well, I was actually a pretty hardcore gamer when Gamergate erupted. I was playing World of Warcraft, and I was a fairly dedicated raider. I spent
Let's give some
three,
context. This was late 2014.
yes, I was spending 3 nights a week raiding with my social group, which is called a guild in World of Warcraft. And this whole thing erupted while I was in the middle of that, and so being immersed in the culture, it was pretty much impossible to miss.
I was not a hardcore gamer, and I still am not. I enjoy video games and tabletop games and board games, but I mostly enjoyed the community of commentary around games, and that's how I became aware of it because a lot of the people, I mean, obviously the YouTube algorithm went nuts with this stuff back in late 2014. So stuff started getting suggested to my feed, and I listened to a bunch of it. And I didn't realize at the time that I was seeing the start of something that would devour the next 5 to 6 years. But I've followed several of the what I would say are the key players and key commentators on it, even though I'm not directly involved with the games movement. Because as we'll discover as we continue talking, I think that Gamergate has repeated itself at least 4 times since late 2014. So specifically like November, December 2014, it's repeated itself about 4 or 5 times since then.
And I believe it was actually the start of a new culture, a new era in public conversation about social issues.
Yeah, certainly it was the start of a new way that we talk about social issues, and unfortunately, a very destructive way on all sides.
Yes. It laid the pattern of people talking past each other instead of with each other.
And attacking in mobs. So all this
Yes.
cancel culture you hear about, I really think you can trace most of the tactics used in cancel culture back to both sides in Gamergate.
I can't think of an incident in modern history nearly as indicative of what was to come. It's been pointed out by some people who study Gamergate that it actually started cancel culture back when the Dixie Chicks were canceled, which was when, of course, Bush was president, and Natalie Maines famously made her comments over in Germany, and basically hit up the "not my president" long before it was a hashtag. And the country music fans took that poorly. Um, and some of the
Mildly put.
reactions, yeah, some of the reactions were quite understandable, but there was a lot of pressure on local radio stations to pull their music from the airwaves. And hundreds of radio stations capitulated to that pressure because, of course, they didn't want to lose their bread and butter, that is, their customers. Some people said that was capitalism in action, but other people say this might have been the most successful boycott, establishing a trend, which was then more on capitalized on by the Gamergate forces on both sides. Because
Yeah, I mean, they're far enough removed by time that I don't know if I could say there's a direct link. And the country music culture and the gamer culture on both sides, the liberal gamer and it's not conservative, it's anti-liberal gamer or anti-progressive gamer
that's
cultures
true.
aren't
And to
really the
understand
kinds that listen to country music or were part of that.
that's true, and to understand the very different reactions, actually, I think it's really important to understand that who were really the players involved in Gamergate. So
Yeah.
Gamergate started when officially, if you want to give a date to it, it would have been in 2014 with the August. In August, Aaron Ganji posted a really angry post. He's a game developer, and he was dating another game developer named Zoe Quinn. And he published a post on an online forum that was basically a tell-all about the relationship when they broke up. And it's debatable how much of it was true or not true. It was an extremely revealing and angry and bitter and accusatory one-sided story that basically ruined Zoe Quinn's reputation. And I'm not going to take a position on whether or not it was justified, but I will say it was certainly really vicious. And the kind of thing I would never want someone in a relationship with me ever to do to me. At the same time, she clearly, they had issues. And that went viral. And it went wildly viral because a series of YouTube videos went up, including one by YouTuber Mundane Map, which was then tweeted out by Adam Baldwin, the actor, with Gamergate as a hashtag. And that's really when the whole thing went completely wild with like people getting involved on one side or the other. And on the side of most of the coverage to that date, it was mostly about the fact that Zoe was getting like really favorable conditions from gaming companies and gaming
Reviewers.
coverage, where the reviewers were giving her super favorable coverage, and her ex-boyfriend alleged that it was because she was having sexual relationships with them. And again, this part of it, what he alleged, is for the most part hearsay, but it really made people angry.
Well, and that was the inciting incident, but I want to bring up a couple of factors that turned the heat up on this cultural issue that caused that incitement to boil over. So one was commentator Anita Sarkeesian, who approached video game commentary from an explicitly aggressively feminist perspective. And her perspective is very clearly recognizable today as critical theory, specifically feminist theory. The more prominent theory today is critical race theory, but we're seeing some resurgence of the feminist movement with the response to the tragic killings in Atlanta, Georgia.
Right. She was definitely a student of critical gender theory.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Another factor was the rise of what you'd call it's a ball of different movements, pieces of which can be called the manosphere, the men's rights movement, the skeptical community, and the neo-reaction. I'm trying to remember if there's another section of that I'm missing. But those,
all of those, they kind of piled on when the feminists jumped in.
well, yes, for obvious reasons, the manosphere is against the feminist movement, and there were three main parts of the of the manosphere, but that's a little deep in the weeds
But
for now.
but there'd been something that had already happened inside the gaming community that had actually really cheesed people off to get Baldwin to even tweet about it, and that was censorship about talking about the topic at all. So, kind of understandably, when Quinn had this thing come out on her own game, she had Depression Quest was her game, and it's this game about trying to make people aware of what living with depression is like. And it actually had quite a bit of support. Well, on her forums, of course, when this came out, she just kind of shut down all the comments and you can't talk about this. And understandably, I mean, if somebody comments negatively on my YouTube channel, I don't necessarily want to see all the garbage that they say when it's like mean and personal, right? But what also happened was Kotaku shut down all the comments about it and they scrubbed them. N4G shut them down. NeoGAF shut them down. Then 4chan, this was astounding to people. 4chan actually shut down comments on it. And nobody could believe that would happen on 4chan. And then Reddit also shut down all commentary on it on games and gaming. And this all happened in August. And that's what really set off the whole integrity in journalism, because a lot of people went, well, wait a minute, what? We can't even talk about things? Like, this is a censorship issue now.
There's another factor, in addition to fairly coordinatedly suppressing discussion and dissent on this issue. They started an aggressive attack on their audience with a series of articles posted on various websites by different journalists positing that the gamer identity is dead.
Right.
And this was an explicit attempt to get rid of their old audience in favor of an audience who agreed with them.
And delegitimize any criticism.
Right.
As well. So they branded everybody.
And I think that actually happened in fall of 2014.
Yeah, it did. And they branded everyone who disagreed with them as trolls, which actually made the term troll almost completely useless.
Yeah, unfortunately.
As Richard Dawkins said, whatever troll might mean, it can't mean anyone who disagrees with me. Yeah. And unfortunately, that is the current definition of troll for all intents and purposes. As anyone familiar at this point with trying to be a dissenting voice on Twitter has found out.
Well, it's been supplanted by other terms because of its inflation, so bots and Russian plants and all sorts of things. But one of the big things, of course, that you see in the discourse on both sides is the name calling. There's absolutely no real sense of dialogue. It's talking past each other, ad hominem attacks, and worse, direct attacks on people's safety in the form of things like doxing and threats.
And I think this is really unfortunate. You brought up Anita Sarkeesian and her feminist frequency, which still exists and is actually quite influential. She was, at the time, she was trying to do a Kickstarter for tropes versus women in video games. And I watched a lot of those, and they brought up a lot of good points. Like, she was really good at identifying some real issues. And instead of people like being able to hear and understand what she was saying, a lot of people just got really reactionary, and understandably so, towards it, to the point they're like, no, I'm not going to listen to any of this. Nobody has any point. There's nothing legitimate there. And she did the same thing to people who were getting into Gamergate on anything. I mean, it was huge polarization. So she couldn't even listen, or anyone supporting her couldn't listen to the fact that there was some real big issues, especially with the Kotaku thing, because it turned out that the relationship between Quinn and James Grayson at Kotaku was indeed verified, and he'd been giving her favorable coverage while having an affair with her.
Yeah. And that leads to the famous cry that Gamergate is about ethics and journalism, which I think has some merit to it, but it was clearly a much bigger cultural fight.
It really was. It really was to the point that battle lines were drawn, and people changed their entire like outlook of what they were doing.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is that in Gamergate, the lines were drawn, but the sides were not what you might expect. There were sides taken in the subsequent iterations of Gamergate that we'll talk about in a bit that are a little more predictable. But Gamergate itself, while almost all the people on the anti-Gamergate side tend to identify as far left or progressive, the people on the pro Gamergate side, certainly you're going to have some conservatives there, but it is not a conservative movement. And I think Kristine had a bunch of identity markers that would surprise people who would think that Gamergate is a conservative movement.
Right. So there was actually a study that was done by Brad Glasgow. He was researching a book that he was going to publish. And what he found out, and there's a political compass for Gamergaters, and they all occupy pretty much the bottom left quadrant. So this almost one of the cases of the left eating itself. But they tend to be liberal or centrist. They were found to be Obama or Labour, Liberal Democrat voters in Britain. The 80% of them believed climate change is real. 90% believed in legalizing pot. 2/3 were anti-death penalty. 90% supported gay marriage. 75% supported socialized medicine. And only 10% of them got their news or read from Breitbart, which was almost the only publication that was giving it a fair shake. And you can read more about this in James Desborough's book, Inside Gamergate. It's a bit ranty. You can tell he wrote it from emotion a lot, but it's got a lot of interesting facts, and it's well researched. Desborough, of course, is the author of The Munchkin's Guide to Power Gaming. So he's a game designer, and he was kind of in the middle of this.
And that's a good point. Gamergate was not just video games. It spilled out into the wider gaming community and the nerdy community as a whole. The subsequent iterations that I was talking about, the first one erupted in the Hugo Awards controversy called Puppygate, which was about prose science fiction and fantasy awards. It then moved to comics and was called Comicsgate. Primarily hitting Marvel, but also DC and independent comics. And I would make the claim, and this is a little less defined because the property that I'm about to name is very, very widespread. But I would argue what happened with the Star Wars fandom when The Last Jedi was released is the third major eruption of what Gamergate started. And then Kristine and I would also argue that what we saw with Donald Trump, and especially with the online supporters of Donald Trump, that's where a lot of the Gamergate energy went in a political way.
Oh, absolutely. And you can also see the media tactics that were used to control and to rebel both sides in the Trump thing are so parallel. Gamergaters used a lot of irony and sarcasm. They used a lot of satire, and it was very un-PC to get back. And it was really hard to draw the line between what was actually like hateful and what was like, well, you guys are saying we're this, so we're just gonna poke you in the eye. There was a lot of that.
And I think it's really important to mention that you mentioned Breitbart because Breitbart was one of the only pro Gamergate publications. Well, that was because Milo Yiannopoulos latched onto Gamergate as his ticket to online stardom, and he reported for quite a while positively on Gamergate. And then, of course, he decided to become a Trump proxy or whatever his particular campaigner. He was a Trump campaigner. And he basically used the platform he built for himself with Gamergate to become that Trump thing. But interestingly, a lot of his people, as you can tell from that slice of demographics, didn't follow him. But they used prominent figures, the media and the anti-Gamergate side used prominent figures like Milo Yiannopoulos as a hammer to hit all of Gamergate, even though it's not a
Yeah.
monolithic movement.
And a couple things came out of that that were really disturbing. One is the use of Twitter block lists, which are now hailed as a huge key to social justice and anti-harassment on Twitter. But they went mainstream with Gamergate, where they would block anybody who tweeted about Gamergate, tweeted about any Gamergate hashtags, or followed anyone who did that. So there was this huge, and Twitter actually suppressed the hashtags, and they were constantly suppressing hashtags, and so the movement kept coming up with new ones. The other thing that was really disturbing for free speech, uh, and the Gamergate people are pretty determined that it's mostly about free speech, and they certainly have a point when it comes to this kind of suppression, right? Because we had the social media, the media companies suppressing comments on and people who made things that were not according to the politically correct terms. But the most disturbing thing was actually journalists, which was a cross-media collaboration that was proven to promote DNC talking points. And Tucker Carlson and Breitbart both covered these. Now, these are not my favorite sources to ever cover. Like, I don't usually quote them as sources, right? But they
Yeah.
both exposed it, and actually Kyle Orton confirmed the journalist. And it was something I already suspected, because news travels too quickly. Like, the main narrative travels too quickly and is too convenient for the DNC. I began to suspect that such a list had to exist years ago, when I noticed that, like, whatever Mother Jones said, the next day all the mainstream media covered it in the same way. But this journalist got exposed as a part of Gamergate.
Yeah. So I think it's difficult to tell who won. I mean, Kristine thinks that the anti-Gamergate side won, and I certainly think that they have as strong or stronger foothold, but the anti-Gamergate side still exists in a way that is not seen with the other movements.
Here's why I think they lost. First of all, James Damore. James Damore was the Google employee who was fired for trying to address reasons that women were not being represented at Google. And what he represented was a watershed moment where people in tech realized, I cannot any longer talk freely at work. I cannot participate in these community conversations if I do not have the right opinion. And the environment at tech companies nationwide has become much, much more oppressive to any employees that do not toe the social justice line. And to the point that the social justice people are now dictating terms to the tech company. I would also argue that it normalized YouTube censorship and throwing people off platforms. Most famously, this is where Carl Benjamin, or Sargon of Akkad, really got tied up, because he lost out on his, not only YouTube, but Patreon kicked him off. And then Subscribestar kicked him off because the banks came to pressure against him for saying unpopular things.
Yeah, there's a very real use of what some of my people that I follow on Twitter call disemployment as a tactic. The idea that
Yes.
your goal is to make sure that no one can make a living who disagrees with you. And I think that's a really destructive thing. Even though sometimes, as in the case of Milo, who is aggressively disemployed, the people who are disemployed are indeed very troubling figures. And I don't have a particular hatred for Milo. I think he's a deeply troubled person, and I really wish he would get some help. But he's clearly also a magnificent scam artist.
That I would
Um,
agree with. He's certainly he's a media personality more than anything who thrives on building his image. He's like he's a social influencer, I guess.
he's also a shock jock. Um, so
But I'm
here's
trying to remember the John Stuart Mill quote. Uh, and in 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 On Liberty, John Stuart Mill writes about what happens when the social stigma against doing things is formidable. And he wrote that if a person was denied their ability, and this is not the direct quote, it's a paraphrase, but if you were denied the ability to make your daily bread, that you were as effectively silenced as if the government put you in prison.
yep,
And
because
so
money is
this,
power. Money is the ability to speak. I mean, there's a reason that people make the argument that suppressing money going towards advertisements or money going towards political campaigns is speech, because it's your ability to make your ideas matter.
right. And he's right. And I think this is part of the reason that the movement, the social justice movement, has gained so much power. And in many, many, many areas, everybody knows if you speak against it, you will be labeled a evil person and you can lose your job. And
And
Gamergate
you will not just
really
lose your
started
job,
that.
but you will also have a very dedicated behind the scenes communication network trying to make sure you can't get another job.
Right, absolutely. And very few people have the money to or the social cachet in order to ignore that.
Yeah, I followed some of the people on the liberal side who've tried to speak out against it from a liberal perspective, and they have been blacklisted. The main one is Liana Kersner, who's a small Canadian YouTuber and journalist who used to be in Canadian television. Um, and she was quite explicitly blacklisted by Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn and several other key figures in the anti Gamergate side, despite the fact that she's an open progressive feminist.
Yeah.
Um,
And I was personally really uncomfortable. I still am kind of taking sides, right? I mean, you can hear my hesitation because I've seen the harassment on both sides.
yeah, both sides
And
just weaponized all kinds of social media against each other, and it was vicious and miserable.
and I honestly didn't want to have anything to do with either the critical theorists or, even though I thought there were a lot of good points being made about harassment online. I think harassment online is really underestimated how bad it is. And some people argue it's worse for men, but I really think it's hard to explain how difficult it can be as a woman. I mean, you guys know I've shared with you the frequency of harassing comments I get from our social media in
Yeah,
my personal messaging, and it's a lot more frequent than any of the men. And the other women in our organization experience the exact same thing. And I'm not making posts on social justice issues, and I'm definitely not like tackling hot buttons, or I shouldn't be angering groups of people with the things that I do. A lot of it's just sexual harassment.
yeah. It's
And
the
so
complete lack of understanding of sexual morality and appropriateness is stunning on the internet from
and that was one of the
mostly men.
things that made me so uncomfortable, was when the men's right activist groups and stuff jumped in on Gamergate, because I was like, oh my gosh, I can't even comment here.
It's a brutal discussion to have if you happen to not be all in on one side. And it's even if you are all in, it's very brutal because the people who are against you are going to be against you, and they will hit below the belt constantly, no matter which side you pick.
Yeah. And it was unfortunate. The Society for Professional Journalism actually tried to put together a convention called Airplay, where they were bringing in people from both sides to talk with each other instead of trying to get them to talk past each other. Like, hey, can you guys just sit down and work through this, and air out what your points are? And that got a bomb threat, and they actually had to clear out the campus where it was being held. And of course,
And
that bomb threat was
unfortunately,
then weaponized as a propaganda tool.
saying that everyone who was against one side or the other was in league with the bomb threat, and it's just
Yes, exactly.
um and I unfortunately have watched a lot of, because Gamergate wasn't really, it was kind of leaderless. There were a couple of major figures, but they weren't really leaders. Um because Gamergate was leaderless and it wasn't really on a political side, it's unfortunate, but the people on the anti-Gamergate side are some of them are very smart, and they've effectively proselytized some of the up and coming pro Gamergate or pro that particular side of the movement. And I've seen it happen multiple times with people who start out being questioning of the anti-Gamergate narrative, that everyone who is pro Gamergate is evil, and so they question that. But then some figures in the anti-Gamergate side come up to those people, whether it's at VidCon or other social mixers for these online influencers and commentators, and then you watch them just start leaning more and more towards the anti-Gamergate perspective, and it really troubles me because I wish there was some kind of leader for the Gamergate side, but all the leaders that tried were too obviously out for their own good, like Milo, like Vox Day, like those are the two big ones that I remember trying to lead, but I don't know. The
Yeah,
one
and Vox
person that I
Day
would
had some associations that made him easy to attack as well.
who?
Vox Day.
Well, Vox Day is just a bad person. He's an avowed racist.
I wasn't going to come out directly and say that, but yes.
Well, if
it,
Vox's
it made
people
him.
find this video, we're gonna have some real fun comments.
This is true.
But
And
the
it
one
wasn't.
person I would say, go ahead.
I'm not actually afraid of Vox's fans or whatever, although, you know, it's just that it's so hard to talk about all this without engaging in rumor, innuendo, and hearsay, because the number of facts that are actually available is ridiculously small because of the huge amount of censorship that's occurred about this, and the fact that the one place you would hope to find anything useful would be like Wikipedia, and forget it, that's
Oh
entirely
my goodness.
controlled by the anti-Gamergate movement.
Yeah, if you look into the edit history and the people who control the protected pages on Wikipedia about these kinds of things, there's a very consistent pattern of what their identity is and what they vote for and what they're very proud of supporting. Like, it's obvious. The
And
fix is in on Wikipedia.
I think you said earlier that there were 4 movements. I would argue there's a fifth one in progress right now, and that is with free speech on campus, period.
Well, that one's been bumping around since 2015.
Yes, but I think its current iteration is very reminiscent of the Gamergate dynamic.
I think
And
that's quite possibly true. I just haven't been as tuned into that. You'd be closer to that than.
yeah, I can confirm, you can confirm from reading the media reports and looking at what universities are doing. There's a distinct side everyone needs to be on now.
Oh, are we talking about like diversity training?
Oh yes.
Okay, so that I can actually confirm from personal experience because I worked at a university for 10 years and I saw the change happen. So yes, I would agree with that. The problem is I don't see the pushback. Well, no, I
That's
guess you're
because
right. With
everyone,
James Lindsay and Chris Rufo, I guess I do see the pushback
right?
starting.
There's been pushback quite a bit at the University of Chicago, which is probably it's been called the last bastion of free speech. What frightens me is that the anti-free speech people there are gaining ground every year.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's so terrifying about it is that it is a movement that says feelings matter more than facts, and it's infecting all of the professional societies. The American Psychological Association actually came out and said that we should consider feelings, people's emotions, and personal anecdotes more than we should consider the facts found from studies when presenting on matters of social import. That just got
Well, I mean, that is what happens when you mainstream the concept of my truth rather than the truth. And I think that's one
exactly
of the things that I really hate about the anti-Gamergate progressive critical theory narrative is just
well,
this insistence that there is no truth, it's all just power.
right, and that there's more legitimate stories and less legitimate stories. That
Yeah,
their
yeah,
narrative legitimacy depends upon your identity,
yeah. As
and
opposed
that
to
really came out
correspondence
with
to
Gamergate.
reality.
That was actually a
Yeah,
real huge issue with Gamergate. And it's one of the reasons the two sides were talking past each other so much, because the anti-Gamergate side is using that kind of framework for talking, and the gamers were not. They didn't even know it. They didn't understand it at all. And I think it's one of the reasons that combating and keeping on task was so difficult.
yeah. Well, and the other thing being that it took quite a while for anyone to come up to really understand what they were doing. Like there were people who would pick apart Anita Sarkeesian or Zoe Quinn. They'd look at their actions and they'd look at like factual inaccuracies about things they said. So I mean, there was this big thing about how Anita Sarkeesian didn't play games because she was consistently factually wrong about details of games, and that's
Yeah,
important, but it's kind of irrelevant when you understand that the real thing that Anita Sarkeesian was doing was critical theory. She was getting critical theory into the conversation so that it set the terms of conversation. And
right.
it took like 3 or 4 years for anyone major in the community to really come up with an understanding of what that was. And we have mentioned him, Sargon of Akkad, Carl Benjamin, has spent the last 6 years going from being mostly a blue collar working class British guy into really giving himself a university education on history and philosophy. And he is now one of the few people who could articulate the problems, but he wasn't able to at the time. And that was
Right.
the problem. We didn't have people at the time who understood really what the anti Gamergate people were doing.
And it's interesting about that. What is a real gamer, right? This is something gamers argue about. And the reason I didn't like the attacks on Sarkeesian in that regard was because, well, like I said, I played World of Warcraft, right? And I was really into it. I could talk forever about World of Warcraft, but I couldn't talk with any knowledge other than from watching videos, But there'd be no in-depth knowledge. If you asked me to talk about Call of Duty, I'd have been lost. I just, and she wasn't necessarily critiquing the gameplay. She was critiquing artistic choices in the games, and this inability to see what someone who disagrees with you is even talking about makes it so difficult to have a conversation with them. And this is a trap that we walk into on conservative issues all the time. The other trap is letting the opposite side control the narrative entirely. This is a double
Yeah,
trap.
which really happened in all of the movements that we've mentioned.
Yes. And it's a double
So
trap that conservatives need to really find a good way to avoid. And I think one of the most important things is to become educated about the language of social justice, understand what people are saying. Now, you mentioned James Lindsay, of course. He and Helen Pluckrose came out with their book, Cynical Theories. And if anyone's looking for a great primer on understanding social justice language and where it's coming from, I strongly recommend that book.
Yeah. There's some of the few people who have actually done the complete work. Like I mentioned Carl Benjamin, and I think he has done a huge amount of work in understanding and educating himself on the philosophies behind what's going on. But Lindsay and Pluckrose have done work that almost no one is willing to do because they've actually read people like Judith Butler and Derrida and Marcuse and Foucault and all of the postmodernist theorists who underlie the critical theory that is today, just in control of so much of the media and our elite classes. I wanted to ask one last question for this topic. What do you think is important for us to know about Gamergate? We've suggested a lot of things like educate yourself on the discourse, understand what's really going on, don't let the opposing side set the terms, and of course, conduct yourself in an ethical way. Do not use the tactics of doxing, harassment, and threatening. But what do you think you would like to leave our audience with on what should we learn from Gamergate as movements continually erupt based in the same cultural clash?
A moral panic. I believe the biggest lesson is that a moral panic can grip almost any group and that it can be excessively destructive. And that just because we live in a modern age does not make us immune to moral panics. And acting out of emotions leads people on every side of every issue to engage in behaviors that I believe they would normally find completely reprehensible.
Yeah. I think for me, it really is you have to do the hard work of growing up and learning to listen. Um, the people I respect most about who came out of Gamergate are those who learn to listen or were already good at listening and are mature. And that means to me putting aside your own feelings of hurt, your own insecurities, your own desires, and being willing to work with other people and see other people as valuable and work towards their good rather than seeing them as enemies, pieces you can use. And I think that's something that we at the War Elephant really do strive towards, is trying to encourage each other towards maturity and listening to other perspectives. I would hope that if you're listening, you can join us both here on YouTube or on any of the podcast platforms you're downloading this from. We have a Discord, which will be linked in the show notes, that's open to anyone to join as long as you're willing to abide by our rules of respect, research, and relaxed, the 3 R's. We also have a lot of content on our primary current platform of Quora, where we host questions and answers from a right-wing perspective, but we are, of course, open to dialogue from all corners of the spectrum. A link to that community will also be in the show notes. I want to thank our host, Jaden, for letting us talk for so long. Thank Kristine for providing her erudite contributions.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation, as always, Ian and Jaden.
Yep.
All right. So until next week, I hope that you will join us on Discord or Quora. Leave us a comment, and we'll see you next time.